As you might expect from its name, implicit bias can be hard to spot. Let me start by giving you a few examples of implicit bias that have been uncovered in recent studies. When whites and African Americans were sent to bargain for a used car, African Americans were offered initial prices roughly $700 higher, and they received far smaller concessions. A regularly repeated study by the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development sent African Americans and whites to look at apartments and found that African Americans were shown fewer apartments to rent and houses for sale. White state legislators were found to be less likely to respond to constituents with African American names. This was true of legislators in both political parties. Emails sent to faculty members at universities asking to talk about research opportunities were more likely to get a reply if a stereotypically white name was used. Even eBay auctions were not immune. When iPods were auctioned on eBay, researchers randomly varied the skin color on the hand holding the iPod. A white hand holding the iPod received 21% more offers than a black hand holding the same iPod. Now that we have discussed a few examples of implicit bias, next, I would like to know your immediate reaction to seeing this symbol. Now, hopefully, your immediate reaction to seeing this would be stop, right? If not, then you may want to retake your driver's test. But again, the first thing that you think of is stop, which is a completely reasonable and expected reaction. I use this stop sign example to segue into some good news and bad news. Personally, I like to start with the bad news first. The bad news is that we all have implicit biases. The good news is that while we all have implicit biases, we can change the way that we react to these biases. Here's what we will cover today. First, we will define what implicit bias is and where it comes from. Second, we will discuss why implicit bias is problematic, especially in the legal field. Third, I will provide you with specific and actionable advice on how to recognize and prevent the negative implications of implicit bias. First, let's go over a few key terms that will help you with your understanding of this topic. The first term is a simple one, bias. Bias means a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way to be considered unfair. For example, hiring a man over a more qualified woman. The next term is stereotype. This word is probably familiar to most of us, but the official definition of a stereotype is an association between a given object and a specific attribute. Some stereotypes are seemingly harmless, like lawyers are amazing people, but a lot of them can be very harmful. Up next is the word implicit, which means that we are either unaware of or mistaken about the source of the thought or feeling, as opposed to explicit, which means that we are aware that we have a particular thought or a feeling. Now we get to the more recently discussed terms, micro-inequity and microaggression. A micro-inequity is a slight that demeans or marginalizes the recipient. For example, saying good morning to everyone except for one person, or routinely excluding a colleague from team events, such as getting coffee or drinks after work. On the other hand, a microaggression is an act that stereotypes or denigrates the recipient. For instance, telling someone that they don't sound black, or I never would have guessed that you were gay. A microaggression is basically making assumptions about how a person will behave because of the way that they look. Finally, what is implicit bias? Implicit bias is a type of mental shortcut. Think back to the red stop sign or symbol earlier. We all create mental shortcuts or associations with symbols to help us process all the information that we encounter every day. These can be helpful in some situations, like when we see a stop sign. We may not see the word stop, but we've created a mental shortcut that big red octagon means to stop. But the problem is when those mental shortcuts lead to discriminatory behavior. Everyone has some implicit biases. It is an impression of a group, often operating outside of our awareness, based on stereotypes and attitudes that we hold. These attitudes and stereotypes tend to develop early in life and strengthen over time. Our implicit biases may substantially differ from the stereotypes and attitudes that we think we hold or self-report. But having an implicit bias does not mean that you act with that bias, and it does not make you a bad person. But where do these biases come from? The answer is everywhere. They come from the messages that we are exposed to from the media and interactions with the people that we trust. The world is a constant stream of information that we sometimes unknowingly process and store. Sources of unconscious bias include family, friends, school, stereotypes in the media, and the observations and assumptions that you make yourself. Implicit associations form early and quickly, so we are usually unaware of when they're being formed. For example, take a look at this picture. Which person in this photo is more likely to become CEO? You don't have to say your answer aloud, but think about it and think about what your answer was and why. Also, something else to consider. Less than 15% of American men are over 6 feet tall, yet nearly 60% of all CEOs are over 6 feet tall. Next, take a look at this picture. If you were being audited by the IRS and needed a good accountant, which of the people pictured here would you pick? Who would be your last choice? Then say, for instance, you needed a lawyer. Which of the people pictured would you pick and why? Again, think about your immediate answer and why that is your answer. Be honest with yourself. As you can see, we all have implicit biases. So I know what you're probably thinking. Well, if we all have implicit biases and don't know when they're being formed, how do we know our own biases? Easily, through taking tests. For instance, the implicit association test, which measures the strength of associations between concepts like race and gender, and evaluations or stereotypes by measuring the associations between the two concepts. The test can identify attitudes and beliefs that people may be unwilling or unable to report because they may not be aware that they implicitly hold certain attitudes or beliefs. The test subject is asked to quickly sort words or faces into categories and answer a topic-specific questionnaire. The score is then calculated based on how well the test subject can complete the assigned tasks. The implicit association test exists for a wide range of topics, like skin tone, race, age, sexuality, disability, and ethnicity. Here are a few sample questions from one of the tests. Respondents are asked to read the questions and answer with responses such as strongly agree, somewhat agree, neither agree nor disagree, somewhat or strongly disagree. In 2014, the Washington Post summarized responses from 1.5 million white participants who took the implied association test based on race. This test for bias against African Americans. This map shows the scores from that study. The darker the red, the higher the level of bias. The darker the blue, the lower the level of bias. This is the kind of information that we are able to glean from the implicit association test. And the more that we are aware of our biases, the better equipped that we are to deal with those biases in a positive manner. This test is available on Harvard's website under the term Project Implicit. Let's take a look now at the legal landscape, law firms in particular. According to a 2017 report by the Vault Minority Corporate Counsel Association, law firms are comprised of 83.6% white attorneys. Let's ponder on that for a second. This means that for every 10 attorneys at a law firm, at least 8 of them are white. The numbers change even more when looking at the demographics of partners. As of 2017, 90.79% of all partners were white. 3.32% were Asian Americans, 2.64% were Hispanic or Latino, 1.97% of them were African Americans. Less than 1% were Native Indian or Pacific Islander, and less than 2% of them were openly LGBTQ or individuals with disabilities. The statistics are even worse in the equity partnership ranks. Indeed, from 2007 to 2015, there has been very little change in the racial demographics of law firm partners. Although the three largest minority groups represent 21% of associates, they only represent 8% of partners. There is a similar trend when it comes to LGBTQ attorneys. As of 2016, LGBTQ attorneys make up 3.24% of associates, but at the partner level, they only make up 1.89%. In terms of gender in big law, women are doing better than they have in the past, but there is still work to be done. Although women make up a majority of law students and 48% of associates, as of 2017, only 19% of equity partners are women, and only 2% of them are women of color. In short, there are more women entering the legal field and becoming associates, but as we look at partnership rates, the number of women severely narrows. The same is true for attorneys of color, except that there are still disproportionate numbers of attorneys of color and LGBTQ attorneys entering law firms. Even though the number of attorneys of color continues to grow, their attrition rates for attorneys of color continue to be higher than their white peers. The same goes for women versus their male counterparts. But why do attrition rates even matter? Well, let's talk money. When an attorney departs, it costs the firm anywhere from $400,000 to $800,000. In fact, the 400 largest law firms in the United States lose roughly $9.1 billion annually due to turnover loss. I understand that this is a lot of information and numbers to remember, but if there is one thing that you should be able to recall, it is why all of this is important, why all of this matters. First and foremost, diversity in the workplace is the fair and right thing to do. Homogeneous workplaces stifle growth and productivity, and clients increasingly expect diverse teams to work on their matters. Second, diversity matters because client expectations are changing. A trend has taken hold in the legal industry where in-house legal departments of some of the country's most prominent companies have begun demanding teams composed of diverse individuals to be staffed on their matters. The message is becoming increasingly clear. Those who fail to embrace diversity risk losing money and clients. The American Bar Association's Resolution 113 is named Promoting Diversity in the Legal Profession. The resolution urges providers of legal services to expand and create opportunities at all levels of responsibility for diverse attorneys. It also urges purchasers of legal services, especially corporate and government legal departments, to direct a greater percentage of the legal services they purchase to diverse attorneys. General counsels have overwhelmingly signed on to the resolution, including general counsels from American Express, CVS Health Company, Walmart, Verizon, and many more. Overall, implicit bias results in more than just statistics. It affects the lives and experiences of real people every day. For instance, attorneys of color have experienced the following: being asked to participate in a client pitch, but not given an opportunity to work on the matter. They have been asked in a meeting to identify the person in charge because it was assumed that they were court reporters or other staff. Latino lawyers are assumed to speak Spanish and are faced with questions about their immigration status. Asian American men were classified as engineers or assumed to have an engineering background, while Asian American women reported being stereotyped as either too docile or a dragon lady. African American attorneys were subjected by non-African Americans to comments to the effect of, "The black thing really gives you an in." There are also common biases related to gender in the legal profession. Female attorneys of color reported they had been mistaken for administrative staff, court personnel, or janitorial staff at a level 50% greater than white men, and reported that they have had equal access to high-quality assignments at a level 28% lower than white men. White women reported that their commitment or competence was questioned after they had children at a level 36% higher than white men. I know that all of these statistics and information can make these seem fairly bleak. Thus enters some good news. We can do something about it, and by listening to this presentation, you've already taken the first step. So feel free to give yourself a pat on the back. But seriously, the first step is education and awareness. It is important to know that implicit bias exists and what biases you possess. This isn't the easiest thing to do by yourself, so there are resources to help you recognize and address your biases. One has already been mentioned, which is the implicit association test that you can find on Harvard's website under Project Implicit. Remember, this test will help you identify attitudes and beliefs that people might be unwilling or unable to report because they may not be aware that they hold these attitudes or beliefs. To really get a feel for the importance of assessments like this one, let's watch this video.
This is an awareness test. How many times does the team in white pass the ball? If you answered 13 passes, you are correct. But did you see the moonwalking gorilla?
As you can see from this video, we often don't notice things if we are not looking for them. That is why it is important to identify and recognize our implicit biases if we want to avoid explicit discrimination. When you identify and acknowledge your personal biases, you can also understand what triggers them. After understanding what triggers your biases, your motivation to be fair is what matters because your biases can be changed, especially when a person is motivated to be fair and unbiased, which brings us to the second step, which is mindfulness. Recognizing our implicit biases can provide motivation to change them. Studies also show that people who pay attention to their assumptions and challenge them can start to change those assumptions. Mindfulness is a stare, not a blink, which means that some decisions require a more explicit kind of thinking rather than an immediate decision. Another important factor to consider is exposure. Exposure, contact, and positive exemplars in environment are incredibly important. Surround yourself with a diverse array of cultural and social situations and individuals. This allows you to reduce your biases because you are actively increasing exposure to counter stereotypical exemplars and finding commonalities with other people. Commonalities help you identify something that places you in the same group as the other person and find some common ground. Here's an example of what may happen when firms and workplaces do not address or recognize implicit bias in the workplace. A certain firm was recently under fire after releasing this picture of its new partner class. As the photo announcement made its rounds on LinkedIn, one lawyer posted that she was inspired to require a diversity check of all service providers as a condition of continued relationships. Other in-house counsel said they were dismayed by the homogeneity of this set of new partners and called the announcement very disappointing. While the particular law firm deleted the post and promised to do better, there were articles written about the post from Above the Law, the New York Law Journal, and the ABA Law Journal. It sparked another conversation about the lack of diversity in promotions within the legal field. What made this even more eye-opening for some was the fact that this law firm ranked in the top 25 most diverse law firms for the last 15 years. If this is part of the best that we are as a profession, we must do better. On an organizational level, you can take charge of arranging implicit bias training for your team. For some of you, it may be helpful to keep a mental objective framework to assess your thinking. This will help you limit implicit bias by allowing more time to objectively consider decisions. Externally, there must be procedural and organizational changes to disrupt the link between implicit bias and discriminatory behavior. For example, O'Melveny & Myers offers an example of a law firm attempting to reduce implicit bias in its hiring process by using a software tool called Pymetrics. The software evaluates summer associate candidates based on a range of traits and uses an algorithm to suggest the best-suited candidates without regard to gender, racial, or ethnic biases. Another tool called Work uses data about individual employees to assess how and when flexible schedules will benefit them and their needs, rather than instituting a broad generic policy for alternative schedule arrangements. Change procedures are also made more effective when an organization holds its member accountable in order to reinforce those changes. Another helpful tool is the ABA Diversity and Inclusion Toolkit, which helps organizations evaluate their diversity and inclusion efforts. The toolkit provides guidance in understanding implicit bias, providing examples of where implicit biases thrive and how they exist. They also provide tools that help you and others catch and correct snap decision-making that may be linked to harmful implicit biases, and make a conscious effort not to exhibit such bias. The toolkit is available on the ABA website and includes links to other helpful websites. I also cannot stress enough the power of in-house attorneys to affect change. Like the general counsels at various large companies that signed on to the ABA resolution, in-house attorneys can do the same thing. Putting pressure on your own companies to set diversity standards for outside counsel will encourage firms to take a look at the demographics of their teams to ensure that they are incorporating diverse attorneys and viewpoints. The realization of the diversity issues that continue to plague the legal industry. Recognition of this issue has given birth to the Mansfield Rule. The Mansfield Rule was inspired by the NFL's Rooney Rule, which requires every NFL team to interview at least one minority candidate for head coach vacancies. As a result of the Rooney Rule, the number of minorities hired to fill head coach positions doubled within a few years after its implementation. The Mansfield Rule borrows from the Rooney Rule by measuring the consideration for participation in client pitch meetings and requesting that participating law firms make appointment and election processes transparent to all lawyers in their firms. The goal of the rule is to boost the representation of diverse lawyers in law firm leadership by broadening the pool of candidates considered for these opportunities. The Mansfield Rule and the subsequent certification has garnered the support of many companies, including 3M, Cargill, Walmart, and many more. When planning unconscious bias training for your organization, there are a few things to consider to ensure that your training is effective. You should make sure 3 factors are present: balance, structure, and action. First is balance. The training must strike an effective balance between limiting defensiveness about unconscious bias while communicating the importance of managing bias. Oftentimes, when members of the majority group hear unconscious bias or are told that they have unconscious bias, they may think that you are accusing them of racism or sexism and get defensive. Effective training shows participants that we have unconscious biases not because we're bad people, but because we are people. Training should highlight the different ways that unconscious bias creeps into all aspects of our lives and not just in ways that negatively impact diversity. It is also important not to normalize the unconscious bias, but rather show how prevalent biases are in our lives in order to address them accordingly. Second is structure. It is important to structure the training around workplace situations. Sometimes it is difficult for people to imagine themselves exhibiting implicit bias in the workplace because most people hopefully try to put their best foot forward in the workplace. But as we have seen from this entire presentation, so far the workplace is rife with implicit bias. Studies show that trainings that focus on workplace situations is more relevant and memorable for participants. You can incorporate such situations by addressing them in day-to-day work, day-to-day recruiting, hiring, team dynamics, and career development. Under these scenarios, this will allow participants to reflect on their own experiences and behaviors in the workplace. Third, and the most important point, is action. The training must be action-oriented, or else why does it matter? All of the information is useless unless people are given strategies to manage their biases. Effective training must equip trainees with action-oriented strategies. Let's go over some, shall we? The hiring process is where everyone begins their relationship with the employer. So it is important that bias is dealt with during the hiring process. When focusing on eliminating implicit bias in the interview process, potential strategies include asking all candidates the same questions to limit the assumptions that can present themselves in the form of well-intentioned questions. Also, being aware of the signals that you give as an individual. Small gestures like negative facial expressions when a certain colleague speaks, or dismissing the idea of one person only to embrace it when offered by another, or continuously mispronouncing someone's name. For instance, the law firm that I mentioned earlier decided to remedy their partner class photo debacle by holding a town hall. This was a great first step in addressing the issue. However, this was the email sent to associates and counsel. Let's all think for a minute about what could have been changed within this email. It helps that it is already circled, but yes, there are quotation marks around the word diversity. Although they are two little quotation marks, they have a substantial impact on how this email is read and received. It can read as sarcastic or disingenuous, and associates or counsel that may have been looking forward to addressing issues regarding diversity within the firm may feel discouraged. While the sender's intentions may have been pure and sincere, these are the little things that can hinder openness within a workplace. Think of the small signals of implicit bias that may act as quotation marks in your individual interactions and ways that you can remove them. Eliminating these actions are small steps towards creating a better work environment and combating your own implicit biases. As a part of these actions, it is important to track workplace progress. For example, in the Mansfield certification process, firms were expected to create and adopt documentation and tracking norms to measure their progress and identify their areas for improvement. This was so firm leaders could compare their past, current, and future pipelines to determine whether they were making progress on increasing the representation of diverse lawyers considered for and ultimately advanced into leadership positions. Tracking and measuring this kind of progress is an important part of eliminating bias. Seeing your progress will boost morale, but if you are not making positive strides, tracking your progress will signal a need to reevaluate the systems that you have in place and find new ways to improve representation of diverse lawyers. One last point to remember is that you can't change what you can't see. This quote is a lesson in micro-messaging. Educate yourself and the people around you about implicit bias and the subtle and explicit ways that they can appear in everyday life. Create an environment that fosters less silence in the face of discrimination. Of course, the changes will not come overnight. Changes will take time through education and being intentional in our thoughts and behaviors. Recently, the American Bar Association has created a new project called the Bias Interrupters Project, designed to reduce the negative and long-standing effects of bias in law firms and corporate legal departments. The project includes toolkits that provide easily implementable and measurable tweaks to existing workplace systems to interrupt racial and gender bias in law firms and in-house departments. I think the name Bias Interrupters is perfect because it does not imply or ask for individuals to be heroes, but asks for us as a profession to interrupt bias in the many forms. If we work together to do this, we can make the legal field a space where people are able to thrive without concerns about race, gender, sexuality, or other immutable characteristics. As this talk comes to a close, I hope that you were able to learn something today that you can take back to your respective workplaces, homes, and communities. As many great leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr. once quoted, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Let's all do our part to help it bend." Thank you.
Thanks for watching Lawdition. Continue watching programs that will challenge your thinking, while getting to know the best lawyers in every field as they share their insights, and all while satisfying your CLE requirements. When lawyers audition for new clients, everyone wins.